Hello and welcome to our first PowerPoint lecture with audio recording for our class of Educational Foundations. We're going to discuss Competency 1 of the Pedagogy and Professional Responsibilities exam, also known as the PPR exam. So this lecture will be useful for both students in my Educational Foundations class and also students who are preparing for the PPR exam in order to become certified as a teacher in Texas. Competency 1 states, the teacher understands human developmental processes and applies this knowledge to plan instruction and ongoing assessment that motivate students and are responsive to their developmental characteristics and needs. Competency 1 has two central themes: environmental influences and how they affect student learning, as well as overall human development. Let's begin by discussing environmental influences. As you probably know through your own experience as a K through 12 student, a person's family, community, and peers play a significant role in student learning. Family, community, and peers can be a positive influence, or they can also be a negative influence. As a positive influence, family, peers, and community can provide love, care, support, and educational enrichment. However, in contrast, a negative environment at home or socially can hurt students' academic development. Some examples of negative influences that interfere with students' academic progress could include drugs, gangs, a disassembling or a breaking up of the family structure that the student was aware of, and of course, violence. The job of the teacher is to ensure that regardless of what kind of social environment the student has outside of school, that inside the school and inside that teacher's classroom, the student has a positive, supportive, predictable, and safe learning environment in which they can grow. One way to do this is to emphasize positive behavior over negative redirection or negative consequences or negative critiques. A nice rule of thumb is to follow the 3-to-1 rule. A teacher should have 3 positive comments for every 1 redirection or negative correction that they make to a student. This way, students see what are the expectations and are regularly reminded of those expectations. And those who are not necessarily following those expectations will probably turn around their behavior once they see that the teacher is providing praise, sometimes additional privileges such as maybe free time at the end of the day or additional recess, and sometimes even rewards such as maybe coupons or bonus points. Thus, instead of emphasizing the negative, causing students to focus on what they should not be doing, positive behavior reinforcement continues to advocate for the desired behaviors, while also providing incentives for students to pursue those desired behaviors. In addition to having positive behavior reinforcement strategies in the classroom, it's very important that teachers establish regular routines. As we've discussed in earlier slides, some students unfortunately come from very unpredictable environments. Perhaps Their parents have been in and out of jobs, or there might be violent gangs in their neighborhood that could cause trouble, or maybe unfortunately their next meal is not always guaranteed. So a teacher must ensure that when the student is in their classroom, that student feels safe, knows what to expect, so it's a predictable learning environment, and also feels supported and welcomed. If students feel that they are supported and welcomed, and they feel that they're in a risk free environment, students will be more likely to collaborate with each other and to learn from their peers. Students will also help each other and develop trust in others. They'll furthermore be comfortable asking for help from the teacher or from their peers and will be willing to take academic risks and more likely to persevere when the going gets tough and possibly um, the content level of the instruction gets a little bit more rigorous. In order for the teacher to establish a positive school environment, the teacher must ensure that students feel that their culture, beliefs, and identity are valued. When students feel that they can be themselves and feel comfortable in the classroom, students will not only want to be there and enjoy the learning process, but students will also be more likely to once again collaborate and take academic risks. If the material gets harder, or if students don't always get the concept immediately, if they feel comfortable to ask for help, or if feel comfortable that they are not being judged negatively by others in the classroom, they're more likely to persevere and continue until they're successful. Thus, academic success is much more likely when students feel comfortable and at home in their classroom. Another important part of a positive classroom environment is when students regularly feel successful. Students should regularly experience success, especially at the beginning of a new content subject or at the beginning of the year. This way, when students start to experience success and build confidence and self esteem, later, if the content does get slightly more difficult, or they start to have questions, or it's not as easy as before, students will still be more likely to persevere because they have a history of success. Eventually, once students are regularly successful at the basic level of academic rigor or difficulty, the teacher can later slowly remove the supports and increase the difficulty level of the content level so that students still gain the adequate independence and the adequate content knowledge and critical thinking skills that they would need, while still having a high likelihood of being successful. Finally, academic content must be relevant to students' lives. It must be interesting to students based on what they like to think about or what they like to do, both in and outside of school. It also has to be relevant to what students' goals are, particularly to what they want to do in the future after they finish their formal schooling. So it's important that teachers link lessons to particular careers or particular activities that are essential life activities that adults perform daily. Also, teachers must understand what motivates students, what they like to learn about, what they care about, and what they want to achieve in the future, so that teachers can connect their lessons to students' interests and goals. Apart from getting to know students' interests and career goals, a teacher must make a strong personal connection with students so that they can gauge if their student is going through a particularly trying time emotionally or undergoing a significant amount of stress. If a student is going through a difficult time in their personal lives, that can affect not only their academics, but their overall attendance in the class. It can also affect their mood or behavior. It could also, of course, affect their grades and their academic performance. It's essential that teachers help students locate the services they need. If students need psychological counseling because they're undergoing a traumatic time in their lives, a teacher must be able to refer their student to someone who can provide professional help. If students are suffering from food insecurity, in which they're wondering where their next meal might be, or if there are economic issues going on in their home life, such as the utilities have been turned off because the parent is out of work, the teacher can help refer that student to a social worker in the school district, or also be an advocate for that student by referring them to nonprofit organizations that provide services for those students. A teacher must first develop, though, of course, before they refer students to those services, a relationship of trust with students so that students feel comfortable coming to the teacher. And ways for a teacher to do that could be to just ask polite, probing questions about how the student is feeling or how the student's family life is going. And once they've developed a rapport with the students, students will most likely open up and explain what is truly going on with the student. As we've talked about in class and what many other people have mentioned in class, it's important that these communications, these conversations, are private. Students do not want to be called out in the middle of class and asked personal questions. Um, if they are, if the conversations are private, however, students will be much more likely to be honest and open. On another note, teachers should also have high but reasonable expectations for their students. They want to ensure that their students know that the teacher has faith in them and believes that the student can achieve their goals and be successful. However, the teacher must also ensure that the student is regularly successful and that the the task or the expectations that the teacher has for the student daily are not above the student's abilities. If they're not if the expectations are not reasonable or maybe out of the student's reach, the student can start to become depressed or have reduced self-esteem or even have less interest in continuing their education because they've had a history of failure. Thus, teachers should have high but reasonable expectations, and they should provide tools and instructional strategies such as instructional scaffolds or supports, regular modeling, guided practice, and sufficient wait time in answering questions so that students are successful. In the past slide, we discussed several indicators of students going through personal life struggles. Another indicator that we did not mention in the last slide could be excessive absences or tardies. If a student is missing class a lot, that's often a sign that something's going on in their personal life, especially younger students. Furthermore, if students show up to class and they seem malnourished or very tired and exhausted and they need to go to sleep in the class, or they feel like they need to go to sleep, or they seem disheveled or not having the appropriate hygiene, that can also be a sign that the student is going through some kind of personal life struggle. Something probably is not going well at home, and it could be poverty. It could be, once again, the utilities are not on because people have not been able to pay the bills, or there's not enough food in the pantry. But it could also be signs of abuse and neglect. It's essential that a teacher does not make assumptions and jump to conclusions and assume the worst, but instead the teacher should have that one-on-one conversation with that student. Leverage that relationship that teacher has made with that student throughout the year to help learn how they can provide support for that student, and to learn more about what ways that the teacher can help support that student overcome these struggles so they do not become a barrier to their academic success. An important theory to understand how the environment affects students' learning, social, emotional, and physical development is the concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs states that humans must first meet their basic physical needs of food, water, rest, safety, and security before people start to focus on higher, loftier goals that are in the far reaching future, such as academic performance, fulfilling one's full creative potential, and feeling a sense of self actualization. People first worry about whether they have food in their stomach, water to drink, shelter to protect them, opportunities to rest, and a feeling of security and safety. And then they start to think about whether their lives have meaning or whether their work has been successful. After humans' basic needs are met, including their basic physical needs and safety needs, then humans start to think about, do they belong in their social environment? Are they having friends? Do they have positive relationships? So that would be the third tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. After that, after all those three things have met, when a person feels that they have their physical needs met, their safety needs met, and they feel that they have significant positive relationships with others, then people start to focus on their esteem needs, the fourth layer of the pyramid. Students start to consider whether they are being prestigious in terms of being successful in either academics or in their work or other activities. They also start to wonder if they have been successful in accomplishing their goals. Later, after the esteem needs, after students start to feel a sense of competence and success, then students start to consider their self actualization needs. Are they meeting their full potential? Are they being as creative as possible in meeting their creative needs? Similar to what we've stated in earlier slides, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theoretical way to understand that teachers must first consider that their students' basic needs are met, that they feel safe, that they're getting enough food and nourishment and care at home before teachers can start to consider whether or not that student has met their full academic potential. Now we're going to discuss the second part of the competency, which is human development. One of the principal pioneers of educational psychology and of our understanding on how children learn was Jean Piaget. He helped found the constructivist movement, and he was focused upon how children learn and how they connect new information to what they've already learned. Jean Piaget coined the term schema to describe how people organize their knowledge and how people connect to their prior knowledge. According to Piaget, children assimilate and accommodate new information based on their schema, their prior understandings, and prior organization of that knowledge. So let's break down those words a little bit because they're very important terms. First of all, when Piaget argued that children assimilate knowledge, Piaget was explaining that students connect new knowledge to what they've learned before in earlier grades or in earlier lessons. After students connect that knowledge to what they've already know, students might also accommodate that knowledge, meaning that they might alter or modify their prior understandings based on their newfound learning. So they might correct some misconceptions or maybe some not very well elaborated thoughts when they are taught by their teacher or their peers the new information and provided more details of that new information. According to Piaget, the ideal state of learning would be a state of equilibrium, where students can explain what they're learning while also connecting their new learning to their prior knowledge and experiences. Piaget explains that in general, when people become regularly exposed to a concept or to an activity, people develop a script or a memorized routine or understanding. For example, if you think about your experience as a kindergarten student, if you can go back that far, you might remember or you might not remember that at some time your teacher explicitly taught you the concept of every sentence must begin with a capital letter and every sentence must end in a period. However, through regular repetition throughout the grades, that has already been part of your script as a student. Now, when you write your papers, you don't probably take a lot of time to think, oh, I must put a capital letter. Oh, I finished my thought. I must put a period at the end. You probably already do that naturally. That is a script that has been memorized and placed in your mind based through repeated practice. Based on that script, you've also built additional understandings. So once in kindergarten, you've probably already created that. You had probably already created that script, so you were almost always starting with a capital letter and ending with a period. After that, teachers used that prior knowledge to then expand on that in first and second grade. In first and second grade, teachers started to explain to you that not only does a sentence have a capital letter, but in order for it to be a sentence, it must be a complete thought. And after that complete thought is done, then is when you put your period. Then after that, your third grade teachers expanded on that knowledge by explaining that yes, you have a capital letter, you need a complete thought, but within that complete thought, a way to tell if it is complete or not is whether it has a subject, a person, place, or thing that does the action, and whether or not the sentence has a verb or action. Then, after you have determined that it's the complete thought, it has that subject and verb, then you put a period at the end of the sentence. And in fourth grade, your teachers expanded on that knowledge, not only connecting to your prior knowledge of capital letter, subject, verb, and period, but they then started to introduce new knowledge such as other parts of speech like adjective, verbs, clauses, etc. Apart from explaining how students learn new information by connecting it to their prior knowledge, Jean Piaget also explained that children undergo 4 stages of cognitive development. One thing to note, though, is that these are not always absolute stages. Sometimes people progress either faster or slower through these stages based on their personal experiences, social conditions, or their physical maturation. Nevertheless, let's discuss each of these stages. From birth to age 2 is the sensorimotor stage. During this stage, children begin to learn primarily through listening. They hear oral speech from their caretakers, their parents or grandparents or guardians, and their siblings. They also begin to learn through the senses, through what they smell, what they touch, what they taste. Then, after about a year, students begin to speak. They also, even as infants, begin to understand how they can intentionally move for purpose. That based on their wants or desires, they can move or act to ideally receive or fulfill those goals. So they start to reach for objects they like, or they start to cry for the purpose of knowing that a caretaker will come. Apart from this, something that's very important as well is that infants start to realize that even though objects may be hidden and might not be physically visible, they still exist. This will be important for later in life because it's the foundation of abstract thinking. Of course, babies cannot think abstractly. That comes much later in life. But this is just the beginning stage in which babies understand that there's more to life than what is seen by the physical eye. An example of this would be a baby would know that their family members still exist, even though they might not always be present in front of the baby. From ages 2 to 7, children undergo the pre-operational stage. They start to understand repeated actions, and they remember the actions or operations in one direction. So if they repeat that order exactly, they can repeat that action. They also are heavily focused on the imaginative world. They like to create their own realities. They like to play and create their own stories and even their own imaginary friends sometimes. Also at this stage, language begins to develop rapidly. Children start to acquire vocabulary very quickly. By age 3, the average person has acquired over 3,000 vocabulary words in their native language. As a teacher, you must make sure that you're connecting to students' prior knowledge or schema. You cannot introduce new abstract concepts that students have never seen before or experienced before. Also, during this time period, students often think egotistically. They're focusing on themselves and their own benefit. So this is when you hear the common refrain, mine, or my toy, or my friend or my food or what have you. Students start to consider primarily their own interests first. Another important part of this time period is that children begin to recognize symbols and symbolism. And so, for example, in kindergarten, and maybe even hopefully in pre-K, children start to recognize that letters stand for sounds or phonemes, or they also connect pictures to concepts or objects to concepts. For example, many kindergarten teachers use a smiley face as a symbol of good behavior or happiness, and children pick up on that. From ages 7 to 11, students go through the concrete operation stage. So this is for the most part of elementary. During this time period, students need hands-on activities. They learn best through that. They also begin to start to think in two directions, especially if they have the ability to manipulate their understandings with their hands or they're doing kinesthetic learning. Students, once again, need concrete objects such as sentence strips or letters or base 10 blocks to better understand concepts. And they also need to have their new information that's taught be connected to what they've learned before and their prior experiences both in school and outside of school. Another important instructional activity for students during this time period is to have collaborative learning and peer interaction. Students benefit from discussing their ideas and their thoughts with others, and they also benefit a lot from peer tutoring. The more advanced students relearn the concepts and learn and practice leadership skills and the ability to explain information verbally through reteaching the information to students who are less advanced and need additional support. One thing to note, though, is that students from ages 7 to 11 in the concrete operation stage will often have difficulty thinking abstractly or learning only through observation. They need to actually physically perform the activity, receive regular modeling from the teacher, and to practice the activity with the teacher's support. The fourth stage in Piaget's theory of cognitive development featured students from ages 11 to adulthood. This stage was called the formal operational stage. During this stage, students had there was a greater variation or difference in ability among students based on their maturity level and cognitive abilities. So you might have a student who's 13 who's thinking at the college level, while you might also have a student who's 13 who's thinking at basically the elementary or junior high level. During this time period, people start to think abstractly and hypothetically. They do not have to directly experience something or physically manipulate something to understand it. They also start to begin to consider the idea of ethical conceptions, morality, and their own identity. Piaget's theories have helped to revolutionize education and learning activities. For example, teachers use discovery learning and problem-based learning partially for the reason of Piaget's discussion of how humans need to experiment so that they can develop their own understanding and their own conceptions based on their prior learning. Another influence that Paget made was to advocate for active learning. Active learning is when the student is physically engaged in the activity. Either they're doing the activity, they're practicing with the content, or they're speaking and verbally communicating and discussing the content with their peers or their teacher. Either way, the student is not just passively receiving the information through hearing it, hearing the teacher say it, but the student is the one who's making their own understandings and their own conceptions by physically or verbally working with the content. Another benefit that Paget discussed was the importance of having a mixture of different types of activities, both collaborative or partner activities and individual activities. Paget discussed how students can learn from each other, but also how students must still be able to develop their own understanding so that they become independent thinkers. So, a mixture of activities is important, not just pure independent learning or pure peer or partner learning. Another influence that Paget made in education is that we now discuss the curriculum and the relevance of instructional activities based on whether those activities are appropriate to students' level of development. We emphasize developmentally appropriate activities. For example, kindergartners would not be given highly abstract activities in which they have to think of hypothetical situations that they've never experienced because that would not be developmentally appropriate for their stage of learning and cognitive development. Kindergarteners would need to have physical representations of what they're learning, and they would have needed to have concrete examples of what they're learning. Another important educational theorist was Lev Vygotsky, who developed the social development theory. Lev Vygotsky elaborated more on what Paget discussed with collaborative learning. Lev Vygotsky explained that people primarily learn through interaction with others. He disagreed with Paget in that people should not spend too much time working alone or having independent discovery, but rather people should and would benefit from direct peer interaction with someone who is slightly more knowledgeable. Vygotsky also advocated the concepts that words and the context in which we use words affect the way people think. Vygotsky further argued that play was a very important element in how children develop cognitively. Probably the most important theory that Vygotsky created in terms of its relevance for educators was the concept of the zone of proximal development. Basically, Vygotsky explained that new information must be taught at the appropriate difficulty level so that children can successfully complete that task. For it to be the appropriate zone or the appropriate level of difficulty, children should be able to complete the task with some supports from their teacher or peers, as well as supports from some intellectual tools or resources. Vygotsky pioneered the concept of scaffolds and how scaffolds were essential elements for learning. Scaffolds is another word to say learning or instructional supports. Vygotsky argued that whenever new content was introduced that was slightly above students' current level, scaffolds should be initially presented and provided so that students have the support to successfully finish the task that they could not do solely on their own. Vygotsky advocated for assisted learning and also advocated that eventually this assistance would gradually reduce in quantity. So, so in the beginning stages of a lesson, the teacher would provide lots of scaffolds and support. They would provide lots of modeling, lots of visuals, or kinesthetic learning activities where they were manipulating the concept with their hands and their bodies, lots of peer support, and maybe some tools like reduced difficulty texts or dictionaries or once again visuals. Eventually, when students started becoming successful in that task, the teacher would gradually remove those supports until the student became completely independent and could do the task without any scaffolds, without the help without the help of instructional tools. Vygotsky also discussed how cultures had different ways in which they retain information. Normally, literate societies or societies where they have a written language will retain information through taking notes, using graphic organizers, writing stories, writing down the information, or drawing the information and then explaining it in words. However, pre-literate societies had different ways of retaining information. They might have repeated folk stories or tied knots or saying folk songs or cultural songs repeatedly to help memorize that information. Vygotsky, to provide further explanation of the zone of proximal development, explained that the zone of proximal development involves cooperative and collaborative dialogue between someone between the learner and someone who is more knowledgeable. It could be either a peer or a teacher. An example of this cooperative and collaborative dialogue might be if you were trying to teach someone how to play a new card game. In the beginning, you would probably play at a low risk way in which both hands, everyone's card hands were available to be seen, and no one would necessarily be the winner or loser. It was just a practice round. And during this time, you would give guidance, also encouragement and tips. You would provide modeling on how to play the game. You provide several practice opportunities and direct feedback for the students. And then you would gradually reduce that support once students started understanding the card game. And eventually, after students were pretty good on their own, you would probably remove all of those scaffolds or supports and let students play independently. Once again, to summarize the zone of proximal development, remember that this zone of proximal development stands for what students can achieve with support. And that support could include the help of knowledgeable others, either more advanced peers, parents, teachers, and other community members. It could also include support from technology and tools, such as base 10 blocks to understand numeracy or a dictionary, like I had mentioned before. Once again, that zone of proximal development gradually expands so that the student needs less and less scaffolds over time, and they start being able to do it on their own. Eventually, the teacher gradually reduces those scaffolds and those supports, and the student can start doing activities completely on their own. After that stage, the teacher can also expand the difficulty level of the information and even introduce more new information and repeat the process. Another aspect of Vygotsky's theories discuss the importance of speech and thinking. So Vygotsky explained that people often learn through social speech, and that is when they begin to communicate out loud to others from ages 2 and above. During that time period, children also have inner speech, which is their thinking, which is not necessarily always spoken out loud. There's also private speech, which is only meant to be shared for that individual person to themselves. So this would be when students begin to communicate to themselves by thinking out loud. And often they'll discuss to themselves how to problem solve and to organize their thinking. Initially, that private speech begins with students talking out loud to themselves from ages 3 to 4. Later, it shifts more toward inner thinking, but there's still sometimes where they might talk out loud to hash out their thoughts at ages 6 through 7 years. And then finally, by age 10, almost all of the thinking is inner focused and silent inside a person's mind. But either way, the person is still cognitively and cognizantly considering what they are thinking and how they're organizing information in their heads. There also has been important studies that show that children with more intellectually stimulating environments where they have lots of questions or learning activities with their caretakers and lots of academic knowledge or academic vocabulary that they're exposed to as children, they end up having a lot more private speech. And this actually leads to them having better problem solving ability as adults. Let's discuss how we can apply Vygotsky's theories to K-12 education. As we've mentioned before, teachers must provide scaffolds to students or supports in their learning. Those scaffolds could be visuals, could be hands-on learning experiences, or kinesthetic learning experiences in which they're moving their bodies while they're practicing with the content. It could be hands-on manipulatives for math, such as counters or base 10 blocks. It could be repeated modeling or several guided practice opportunities. It could be peer support, or it could also include technological support and tools. Eventually, though, those scaffolds should be removed. Another important way to apply Vygotsky's theories is the concept of reciprocal teaching. So when people learn new information, they benefit from reteaching it to their peers or to others. It helps further clarify their meaning. Also, it's very important to go through a regular process that you can repeat each time you are presented with new information or a new text. And this could include 4 skills that students always perform with their teacher and then eventually start to perform on their own. And so when they receive new information or a new text, they first could summarize it. Then they start to ask questions and think how they could relate to it, or what ways they could learn more about the information. Then they start to clarify Vygotsky also explained that community has a significant effect on students' learning. and that students learn primarily through socialization and through interacting with others. And they learn this before they learn on their own. Furthermore, Vygotsky discussed how different cultures learn in different ways. And so this thoughts helped pioneer the concept of learning preferences or learning styles. And we'll discuss this more in chapter 2 or competency 2. Furthermore, environment has a significant influence on how students think as well as their interests. Adults play a crucial role in teaching children cultural norms and in transmitting intellectual knowledge across the generations. Now we're going to discuss Erik Erikson and his theory of psychosocial development. Erikson argued that people develop their personalities by going through 8 stages of development. In stage 1, trust versus mistrust, infants ages 0 to 1 are unsure about the world around them. They are largely dependent on their caretakers for nourishment, protection, shelter, and comfort. They look toward their caretakers for stability and consistency, as well as love and affection. Based on those children's experiences at home, they will develop a conception of whether or not people are good and can be trusted, or whether people are bad and should be mistrusted. Logically, if children receive consistent, reliable care, they're going to develop trust in adults. And this trust will help them be more likely to create positive confidence and positive relationships with their teachers later when they start school. However, if infants receive a lack of dependable care, an inconsistency, and a lack of affection, they will often begin to mistrust adults. They will have a more difficulty connecting with their teachers. They will be less likely to have hope during future crisis. They will not know to turn to others for help or feel safe during uncertainty or during situations where there's increased difficulty or stress. In stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt, children ages 1 through 3 begin to start doing things on their own. Walking, putting on clothes, choosing what toys to play with, potty training. And parents should encourage children to do things independently. However, parents should also make sure that that student is successful and provide support so that those students are successful. If children feel supported and encouraged, they feel autonomy, self-control. They also feel self-esteem. They feel accomplished and competent, that they can do things on their own. However, if students are overly criticized, they'll begin to feel shame and they'll lack self-esteem. They won't have confidence in themselves, and when they face difficulty situations that are not routine, they'll be likely to shrink back out of fear. Another negative way that children should not experience during this stage would be a feeling of being overprotected. Parents shouldn't overprotect their children during this stage, because if they are overprotecting or babying their children, the children are more likely to feel doubt in their own abilities. And they're also more likely to become dependent on others later in life. During stage 3, initiative versus guilt, children ages 3 to 7 continue to take more and more initiative. They start to make up their own games and make more and more everyday choices: what food they eat, what clothes they wear, who they become friends with. if they're successful in making choices and they're encouraged by adults, their teachers, and their peers, children will develop confidence in their abilities to make choices. They'll also develop confidence in their ability to lead others and to accomplish their goals. Children also at this time are more and more likely to be interacting with their peers because they're beginning to start school during this time period. They're also beginning to ask more and more questions, and those children should be encouraged to do so. They should never be asked not to make questions or made themselves feel that their questions are annoying or a nuisance to others. If children are not comfortable asking questions, they'll have they'll be less creative, and they'll probably be less likely to think critically about their learning and to think outside of the box. In fact, people learn primarily through asking questions and getting answers. And so, if children are not encouraged to ask questions and to consider things in different ways, or to ask why or how, they are missing out significantly on their academic development. It is important, though, during this stage that children have a balance of their initiative and guilt. And by initiative, Erickson means their free will or their own selfish desires. And then guilt would be a feeling of morality or a feeling of consciousness that their actions were not appropriate. For example, if a child has too much initiative and thinks that they are perfect or superhuman, they will not have self-control, or they won't necessarily feel bad about how their actions could negatively affect others. However, if they feel too much guilt, if they're always being criticized or babied or excessively punished, they're going to feel guilt and shame. If they feel so much guilt and shame, they're less likely to socialize with others. They'll also be less creative and less likely to take academic risks. So there needs to be a balance. They need to be humble in their abilities and how their actions can affect others, while also being confident in themselves and their positive contributions that they can make. Stage 4, industry versus inferiority, is when children are approximately ages 7 through 12. During this time period, teachers play an important role, an even more important role and significance in children's lives. Peers also start to become a very important influence in children's lives. The child works to develop competence in skills that the child thinks that society values. So if the child sees that adults emphasize success in reading or success in being able to add or subtract or memorize the multiplication tables, or even success in sports, for example, the child will make sure that they are developing those competencies. And if they do develop those competencies and are successful, they'll have increased pride for their success. During this time period, it's very important that children are not just encouraged for successfully completing something or having a final result that's desirable, but also in the amount of effort and hard work that they put forward to complete a task. If they feel that their effort and hard work contributed to their success and they see the value of that, they'll feel industrious and more competent in their own abilities. However, if the effort, hard work, and small successes are not encouraged, students will feel inferior. They might question their abilities, and it might lead to them not meeting their full academic material potential. Some initial failure might be okay during this stage because this would allow students to develop some kind of modesty that they're not perfect and that they might not always be successful the first time. However, repeated failure is not desired because students will feel a sense of inferiority. The main takeaway for teachers who are teaching these students who are elementary school level is that teachers must emphasize the, the importance of effort, practice, and hard work. Teachers should not simply emphasize whether or not the student got the correct answer or completed the assignment in time and or performed the desired activity, but the teacher should also emphasize students' progress and how through their hard work, effort, and through asking help from others, from their peers and their teacher, they were able to successfully accomplish their goals. If only the product of their actions is emphasized, students might become frustrated whenever they are not successful, and they might think that they are a failure or they might give up. However, if they have always been encouraged and their effort and hard work has always been emphasized over the product of their actions, students will know what to do when they're not initially successful the first time. They'll know that if they continue to work hard, ask for help from others, practice, and continue to try their best, that eventually they will be successful. So when a situation does arise where they're not successful the first time, or the difficulty level has increased significantly so that the task is a lot less easy than they're used to, children will persevere. Stage 5, identity versus role confusion. This is the stage that adolescents or teenagers go through. During this stage, students try to find their true self and their personal identity. They start to develop their own sense of morality and values. So they start to think about what is correct, what is right, and what should be, how the ideal world should look like. They also start to look toward the future and they start to develop their future goals, such as career goals and academic goals after high school. They begin to turn to peers rather than their parents. Their peers play a pivotal role during this time period. They also might experiment with different friends groups or social groups, and they also might test boundaries. They could be initially uncomfortable with their body or identity and the rapid changes that their body or identity is going through, but eventually, ideally, the child or the adolescent, the young adult, grows confident in themselves. If if the adolescent or teenager is successful during this stage, they can develop fidelity. They can commit themselves to others, and they're more likely to accept differences in others and to be accepting of people who hold different beliefs, ideologies, cultures, or backgrounds. Since they're more comfortable with themselves, they are less preoccupied that other people are not exactly like themselves. During the identity versus role confusion stage, adolescents might experience role confusion of their exact place in society. They might even have an identity crisis in which they'll try out different lifestyles or different activities or different interests. It's important that teachers do not pressure students to conform to a particular identity. If they pressure them too much, that could lead to rebellion, in which the child or the teenager does the exact opposite just for the purpose of rebelling. It also could lead that teenager to develop a negative identity or a sense of unhappiness of who they are. Stage 6, intimacy versus isolation, occurs during young adulthood. If the young adult has successfully completed stages 1 through 5, they will be able to expose themselves to being vulnerable to others and to develop emotional intimacy in which they can get attached to people. They'll be able to develop positive relationships in which they will be safe, have commitment to others and their relationships, and exhibit care for others. They'll feel safe and vulnerable to reveal their inner ideas, beliefs, and goals. However, if they were unsuccessful in the earlier stages, during this time period, they'll be likely to feel either isolated, depressed, or they might even enter into negative relationships in which they are not being loved and cared for, and the relationships are not a safe place for them to express their inner ideas, beliefs, or goals. Next comes stage 7, which is middle adulthood, or people who are probably in their 30s to 50s. And it's called the generativity versus stagnation period. During this time period, people start focusing on how they can contribute to their family, to their profession, and to society as a whole. If they feel like they have been successful in their work and in their contributions, they'll develop a sense of accomplishment. They'll feel useful, and they'll develop a virtue of care. However, if people are failing in this effort, they'll be less likely to be involved in society and in their families. They'll feel unproductive and low self-esteem, and they might even turn to focusing primarily on their own selfish desires. In stage 8, ego integrity versus despair, senior citizens progressing through the late adulthood stage further self-evaluate their life and their impact on the world. If they have a positive opinion of their legacy, they sense that their life has integrity and has a sense of wholeness and coherence. There was a purpose to their life and the actions that they did. However, if they have a negative opinion of their legacy, they will probably have excessive regrets. They'll feel despair, they might be depressed of what they've done wrong, and they also might feel hopeless to any possible way to contribute to their families or societies. Ideally, adults should have wisdom. They should be able to reflect on the positive aspects of their contributions while also admitting their regrets and learning from those regrets and changing their behaviors in the future and advising the younger generations to not make the same errors. This is called, once again, wisdom, according to Erickson. Now let's go into further detail on how we could apply Erickson's theories in K through 12 education. First of all, teachers, as we've stated earlier, must be dependable, consistent, and trustworthy role models for their students. They must encourage their students to feel comfortable, to take risks, and to make mistakes, but to learn from those mistakes and to improve in future attempts. Teachers should provide scaffolds and supports so that students regularly have success, so that they build up confidence and a feeling of industry. After students develop confidence and are feeling successful, teachers can gradually release the responsibility of the lesson so that students have more and more independence and feel more and more autonomous in doing the learning activities on their own. Furthermore, as Erickson explained, peers play a pivotal role in adolescents' lives. And even earlier, during the elementary stage, peers also play a very important role. Thus, it's important that cooperative learning, such as learning in groups or with partners, is regularly applied in the classroom so that students not only learn from their peers, but they're also more engaged and excited about the lesson at hand. Another important element that we could apply Erickson to K 12 education is the importance of providing students with choices and responsibility. This provides them a sense of autonomy and allows them more self esteem and feelings of competence. And so, when you're just choosing as a teacher what types of activities you're providing, focus on trying to provide more student led activities rather than teacher led activities in which the teacher is primarily the one either lecturing or actually working out the problems or demonstrating the knowledge. Another important element that we should consider is that students should be able to safely experiment with their identity if they desire. So, teachers should not criticize a student for changing their way of dress or maybe choosing a different political ideology or a different group of friends than they might have chosen before, as long as that student is not negatively hurting themselves or their peers. Let's quickly discuss James Marcia's identity states. James Marcia's identity states focused on how adolescents or teenagers feel at a particular time. Marcia explained that identity foreclosure occurs when adolescents feel dependent on adults. During this time period, adolescents are completely respectful for parents. They have low self esteem, and they often see things in the extremes, so that it's either black or white. It's either, there's no shades of gray, there's no middle ground. And the next stage that adolescents grow through is the identity moratorium stage. During this stage, students begin to develop high self-esteem, but they also start to have high anxiety. They start to develop their identity, but they also start to face difficulty understanding how their identity relates to their family and to society's expectations. They also start to consider morality. Next is diffusion. During this time period, adolescents feel isolated. They start to worry that life is overly complicated, and they might even put off making difficult decisions such as where to go to college or what kind of career they want to choose or what kind of family or people they would like to have in their lives after as they become adults. Finally, the adolescent goes through identity achievement. During this stage, the adolescent develops high self esteem, becomes autonomous, and also becomes loving toward their parents. They start to respect and appreciate all of what their parents have done for them. They also start to consider opinions of others, and they develop more interest in learning because they see the importance of how their learning connects to their future career goals and their future academic goals. They start becoming more aware of their strengths and their weaknesses, and they they start to develop their basic values and goals. They have their fundamental values that they consider important in life and they hold dear. They further start to take additional responsibility if they make errors or mistakes. And they also take additional responsibility in leading others and in making decisions. Another interesting theory is Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral judgment. This helps explain how children develop their morality and ethics. Level 1 involves pre-conventional morality. The first stage of this level involves punishment and obedience. During this sense of morality, children follow authority and they do things because they're scared to get caught. Later in stage 2, individualism and exchange, the individual starts to believe that all people are selfish, and so because people are all selfish and doing things for themselves, the individual will also do things for her or his best interest since everyone else does that as well. Next is level 2, conventional morality, which is a higher level of morality. In stage 3, it's called the good boy, nice girl orientation. During this stage, children look for approval from their family and society. If they are getting approval from their family or from their peers, then they will continue to do that action. They consider what is moral or what is right based on how others perceive it. In stage 4, the law and order orientation, children will follow the rules and laws so that they can keep order and so that society will function well. So they know that in order to keep the status quo or to keep things the same that they're used to, they're going to act like everybody else has been acting or how they've been taught to act. The third level, which is the highest level of morality and judgment and ethics, is post-conventional morality. Stage 5 of this is called the social contract and individual rights concept of morality. During this stage, children recognize that following the law is in the best interest of everyone. But sometimes there are bad laws, and that sometimes morality does not always correlate with what the law says. In stage 6, universal principles, the individual cares about justice, respect, dignity for all people. So while the person thinks that laws should be obeyed in general, they realize that they need to do what's right regardless of what the law says. They also understand that there's unique circumstances which can affect what actions to take in each situation. There's no always these absolute wrong or rights. Carol Gilligan provided a feminine perspective of morality and how children develop their sense of morality and right and wrong. She argued that most psychological theories and theories of moral and ethical development were based in the context of boys and men. They came from a male perspective. Most of the people who were interviewed were male, and most of the people who created those theories were male. And so she argued that women go through an entirely different process of moral and ethical development. She argued that women often base their judgments more on caring for others than for following the rules. She explained that there are 3 stages of moral development: pre-conventional, in which the individual focuses on survival and their own self-interest; conventional, where they start to self-sacrifice themselves to help others that they care about; and finally, post-conventional morality, which is the highest level of morality according to Gilligan, in which an individual chooses not to hurt anyone, including themselves. So they care not only about others, but also themselves and do what's in their best interest of people they care about while not hurting themselves and not self sacrificing themselves to the point where they are being compromised while others benefit. Thank you for listening to this lecture, and I look forward to your comments as well as seeing you in class.